Let's continue with the example we created in the previous section in building an executable. It's important to understand that before we can build an installer, we must first create one of the items that can be installed, for example, an executable. Let's right-click on the build specifications and choose New, Installer. Much like when we build an executable, this brings up the installer properties, which are a series of categories and fields which we can set. Under product information, we can choose the specification name, for example, my installer, the product name, executable build. So let's specify instead, this is the circular buffer installer for the circular buffer EXE. We can choose the destination. As before, it's chosen the default setting, which is C builds. And like before, let's choose a different directory. Let's again return to the My Project directory, and this time create a new directory called Installers. The benefit of creating a separate directory from the EXE builds is this is often the case that we only want to distribute the installers to someone, so we can easily access them. Open that directory and choose Current Folder. Also, we can specify the product version, we can specify whether it's automatically incrementing, and we have the ability to specify our company name, website address, contact, and company phone. Again, these fields are chosen from the default settings when we installed Labview, and it may very well be the case that the URL is not correct. So take a careful look to ensure that this information is correct if you haven't manually filled it out. The next category is source files. Here we have the ability to add any of the relevant information within our project. So we see here, specified under the build specifications, is our circular buffer EXE build. Plus we have a list of destinations on the right-hand side. If we expand this, we see that this particular build contains the aliases, the EXE file, and the INI file. But as one object, it's the EXE build which we want to include as our source file. Here we have a list of destinations on the right. We see here the common application directory, the Labview directory, and so on. Typically, we want an installer to install a program into the program files folder. So let's go ahead and add that there. So we see here this is going to create a directory called EXE build under the program files folder. We can change that. We can right-click and choose to rename the folder. We can call this instead circular buffer EXE. Then later, when this installer is built, when it's run, it will automatically put the files in that directory. Notice how we can also choose to have certain things installed into the system folder or the temp folder. And if we expand My Computer, we have access to any of the support files which we may have included in our project, such as PDFs for manuals, INI files, configuration files, or data files, in addition to individual VIs, which we can also have manually placed in various directories as part of our installer. It's typically the case that it's just the executable specification which you want to place in the program files folder. The next category is source file settings. Here we can choose how each of the specified source files behaves. Typically we don't have to modify these, but we could, for certain settings of certain files, choose to set, for example, read-only, hidden, system, or vital, or if it's a COM object, we can choose to register that COM object. Typically we don't have to change these. Next, we can specify the shortcuts. This will create any shortcuts necessary to allow us to point to the files that we're installing. In this case, we're just installing an EXE, so the shortcut which has been created by default points to the circular buffer EXE. We see it here, the target file, program files, circular buffer EXE, circular buffer.exe, as well as the directory and the subdirectory. If we wanted to have shortcuts created to any additional files, such as help files or PDF manuals, we could add those shortcuts here by clicking on the plus button. That then brings up a window to select target file, and we could then click on the required file. The next setting to discuss is additional installers. Here we have a list of all of the installers which we have available on our system. Notice that the one selected by default is the Labview runtime engine. If you're deploying an executable, you must have the Labview runtime engine running on the computer that the executable is going to run. It's not necessary to have the development system, but the runtime engine is required. Plus, the runtime engine must match the version of Labview you're using when you build the executable. So we see here there's a variety of choices of runtime engines from 7.0 up to 8.5, and that will depend on how many versions of Labview you have installed on your computer. But notice how it's also possible to include other installers. For example, DACMX, if it's a data acquisition system, or IMAC, if it's an image acquisition system, FieldPoint, function generators, and so on. In this way, we can save the user the effort of having to go find the right installation files, and we can have the installers included as part of our installation. The advantage of this is obvious. It makes the installation system simpler. The disadvantage is, though, you can end up with a very large installation file. The next section to discuss is the dialog information. This section allows us to specify what we see when we install our program. For example, we could say in the welcome title, Labview Mastery EXE installer. And we can specify a custom message. We can also include a custom readme file and then navigate to that file, and or a custom license agreement and then navigate to that file as well. Notice how they must exist within the project. However, it's possible to dynamically add it into the project by clicking the Add button and then browsing for it. Let's leave both of these off for now. The next section is the registry. This allows us to specify important keys into the Windows registry. We can do that by choosing the plus sign to add a registry, give the value a name and relevant data. In addition, we can create new directories and new sections within each of the destination registries. We'll just remove those changes. It's also possible to specify hardware configuration to be included as part of our installation. If we check this, we can go ahead and select a configuration file. If we choose Configure, this then brings up the configuration export wizard that allows us to specify exactly which sets of data are configured from Macs, whether it's the DACMX, the Visa, NIMotion, image acquisition, and so on and so forth. If we go ahead and export that, then we can include that as our installer and be sure that when the installer is run on a second computer, that not only is the executable installed and able to run, and not only are the installers included, such as the runtime engine, but we can also ensure that the appropriate hardware configuration is there. That can include tasks, global channels, and so on. In addition, we have the choice of the import mode, whether it launches the Mac's configuration wizard after installation, that allows them to selectively turn on or off the various imports, or whether it happens silently in the background, choosing whether to merge the imported data or replace the existing data. The next section is the advanced section, and this is where we can specify things such as media spanning. This makes sure that if our installer is larger than one CD, it will be automatically spanned across multiple CDs. We have other choices here: extended CD, DVD, or custom. For example, we could have it split into nothing larger than 4 megabyte chunks to perhaps get around a limit in our email system. The next is to choose whether to run an executable after installation. Here we can choose which executable to run, as long as it's part of the project, and any command line arguments that are necessary to send it. We also can choose whether or not to install the custom error code files, or whether to require the development system be present. You may want to do this if your system cannot be run without Labview actually being installed. We can also specify what level of Windows is required, whether it's 2000 or later, XP or later, or Vista or later. Let's go ahead and click OK, and now see that our installer specification has been created. We can save our project now, and we can right-click to choose Build to build this installer. Notice how it's now adding the necessary installers for the runtime engine and adding the necessary distribution files. Then once it's done, you click Done. And now let's navigate to that directory. Within our installers directory in My Project, we have a directory called Volume which has been created. It's got a series of support files and one file called setup.exe. And now if we run this executable, we see that we have a message calling it circular buffer exe, Labview mastery exe installer, and custom welcome message. That was the information we placed into that one field of the categories. When we click next, we're prompted with a Windows standard installation screen. So we choose the directory where our executable is going, plus the ability to choose where our NI products get installed. NI products would be, at the very least, the NI Labview runtime engine, or perhaps also any other installers that you've chosen. Then when we choose Next, we're prompted with the NI license agreement and any other license agreements which we may have optionally selected, and the ability to start the installation. Then when it's done, you're prompted with the fact that the installer has finished updating your system. We click Finish, and the installer is now done. Now, if we navigate to C Program Files Circular Buffer EXE, we see now that an executable has been installed, and if we were to go looking in the Start menu, you'd see that a shortcut was also created.